Imagine being a royal mortician in ancient Egypt, faced with the most disturbing task of your career. The pharaoh's wife lies on a marble slab. But this is no ordinary mummification. You've been commanded to preserve her body in a way that violates all sacred traditions. And the reason for this is chilling. This wasn't fiction. This was a daily reality of intimate practices in ancient Egypt that went so far beyond what even modern minds would find traumatizing. You think you know everything about Egyptian civilization. Golden treasures, magnificent pharaohs, mysterious pyramids. Here you are. Ancient Egypt, which they didn't teach in school, was so extreme that Victorian archaeologists literally hid evidence of sexual practices, so extreme that royal children were subjected to horrific abuse by their own families, and religious festivals turned into week-long orgies of violence and sexual chaos. What I'm about to show you will make you question everything you thought you knew about one of history's greatest civilizations. Because the truth about Egyptian intimate practices is so disturbing that museums worldwide have tried to hide the evidence for over a century. Between 3100 BC and 30 BC, along the fertile banks of the Nile, Egyptians developed practices that would shock even the most liberal modern minds. This wasn't just about personal pleasure or religious ritual. It was about cosmic control, divine power, and the systematic use of sexuality as a weapon of political domination. Pharaohs weren't just kings, they were living gods whose intimate performances were believed to directly control the fertility of the Nile, the success of harvests, and the survival of Egyptian civilization. This created immense pressure to prove divine power through increasingly extreme displays. The evidence comes from temple inscriptions, never seen by tourists, papyrus documents describing practices too obvious for museum displays, and archaeological discoveries deliberately concealed from the public by Victorian scholars. When 19th-century archaeologists first encountered explicit sexual imagery in Egyptian tombs and temples, they were so scandalized that they either destroyed the evidence or locked it away in private collections. Egyptian society operated on the principle that sexual energy was cosmic energy. Every intimate act was potentially a religious ritual. Every orgasm was a conversation with the gods, every sexual position a form of prayer. This belief system created a culture in which the boundaries between worship and intimacy, religious duty and personal pleasure had completely dissolved. But this cosmic sexuality also had a dark side. Children born into elite families were trapped in a system that viewed their bodies as religious property. House slaves faced systematic sexual abuse that was not only legal but also religiously required. And when something went wrong, when the Nile didn't flood, or when crops failed, sexual practices became increasingly desperate and violent. The discovery that changed everything didn't occur during a dramatic tomb excavation, but in a quiet laboratory in 1925. While Howard Carter's team was conducting the first detailed examination of the mummy of Tutankhamun, they noticed something that would disturb Egyptology for the next century. The child king's genitals were missing. They were undamaged, undecomposed, but surgically removed with the precision of a skilled physician. The cut marks were clean, deliberate, and showed signs of having been made shortly after death as part of the mummification process. But Tutankhamun was not alone. As more royal mummies were examined using increasingly sophisticated techniques, a disturbing pattern emerged. Multiple pharaohs and nobles showed evidence of genital removal or alteration. Some were completely castrated. Others showed signs of enhancement procedures involving the insertion of foreign materials. The most shocking discovery came from the tomb of an unnamed prince from the 18th dynasty. His mummy revealed not only missing genitals, but also evidence that the removal had been done while he was still alive. Medical analysis of the bone structure and tissue remains indicated that this was not a punishment or accident, but a deliberate religious procedure. Ancient Egyptian texts began to take on a disturbing meaning. references to perfecting the dead for the afterlife, explanations of preparing the body for eternal service to the gods, and instructions for altering the deceased to ensure proper spiritual function in the next world. The results were astonishing. If Egyptians routinely altered the genitals of their dead, what did this say about their attitudes towards sexuality and the human body? Were these alterations purely posthumous, or did they reflect practices performed on the living as well? But perhaps most disturbing was the way Victorian archaeologists systematically concealed this evidence. When early Egyptologists encountered explicit sexual imagery or evidence of sexual orgasmy, they didn't just ignore it. They actively suppressed it by removing artifacts from public display and editing accounts from official reports. For over a century, the true extent of Egyptian sexual practices was obscured not by ancient secrecy, but by modern shame and Victorian moralism, unable to accept what the evidence clearly showed. But the missing genitals were only the beginning of what archaeologists discovered. The Egyptian system of sexual control operated through a complex hierarchy that determined every aspect of intimate life. At the top stood the pharaohs, whose sexual performance was crucial to Egypt's survival. Below them, nobles and priests faced immense pressure to prove their worthiness through sexual displays and religious devotion. At the bottom were the domestic slaves, especially children, who were subjected to systematic abuse that was not only tolerated but also religiously mandated. Royal children born into this system faced a particularly gruesome fate. Ancient Egyptian texts describe how elite families dedicated their youngest children to temple service from an early age, where they would be trained in sexual techniques. As young as 6 or 7, these children were taught that their bodies belonged not to them, but to the gods. The training was extensive and brutal. Children learned specific positions, techniques for prolonging pleasure, and methods for maintaining arousal during lengthy religious ceremonies. They were taught to detach from their own physical sensations, viewing their bodies as tools rather than personal property. Medical papyruses describe the physical toll this training took on young bodies. Children developed chronic injuries from compulsory flexibility training. Their growth was often stunted by malnutrition, designed to maintain the childlike proportions preferred by adult clients. Many died from internal injuries or infections related to involuntary activities at an early age. But the abuse extended far beyond temple education. Wealthy Egyptian families routinely used domestic slaves for pleasure, especially children, who were valued for their innocence and docility. Legal documents indicate that child slaves could be bought and sold, particularly for involuntary purposes, and their value was determined by age, appearance, and education. The psychological impact was devastating. Survivors who survived into adulthood exhibited symptoms that modern psychologists would describe as severe trauma. They struggled to form normal relationships, often became involuntarily obsessed or completely withdrawn, and often died young from what ancient texts euphemistically termed a broken heart. Perhaps most disturbing was how this abuse was legitimized by religious teachings. Priests taught that sexual service to the gods was the highest form of worship. Children chosen for this service were not sacrificed, but blessed. Families were encouraged to feel honored when their children were chosen for temple duties, even if they knew what the reality would be. The economic dimension added another layer of horror. Archaeological evidence shows a 73% mortality rate among temple children, and medical analyses reveal procedures that took up to 6 hours to complete. Wealthy patrons paid exorbitant prices for access to child slaves, funding a systematic slavery industry that lasted thousands of years. But if you think this is the worst Egyptian children faced, you're not prepared for what came next. This systematic abuse is nothing compared to what happened during the Feast of Drunkenness, Egypt's most infamous religious holiday. What I'm about to reveal to you involves practices so extreme that when the first archaeologists discovered the evidence, they literally burned the documents,
rather than translate them for public consumption. What I'm about to tell you will make everything you've just heard seem like a children's story. The next practice combines religious worship with involuntary violence on a scale that would shock even modern audiences. This involved plunging an entire civilization into a week-long orgy of chaos, and archaeological evidence proves that it happened exactly as the ancient sources describe. Before we get to the most disturbing part, hit the like button if you can handle what comes next, and comment below to let me know where you're listening from. It's incredible that people around the world are connected by the same curiosity about the darkest periods in human history.
The Feast of Drunkenness represented the absolute pinnacle of Egyptian sexual extremism. It was an annual festival dedicated to the goddess Hathor, who transformed all civilization into a week-long orgy of violence, sex, and religious chaos. What began as a celebration of divine femininity devolved into what would be considered a crime against humanity by modern standards. The festival's origins lie in Egyptian mythology, particularly the story of the lion goddess Sekhmet, who nearly destroyed humanity in a drunken rage. Legend has it that the gods flooded Egypt with beer mixed with red ochre to trick Sekhmet into thinking she was drinking blood. This intoxicated her so much that she forgot her murderous mission and transformed into the gentler Hathor. This myth became the template for an annual celebration that encouraged every Egyptian to drink until they attained a divine aspect. But the festival went far beyond simple intoxication. In their drunken state, the participants believed that the gods were their vessels, free to act on any impulse without moral or legal consequences. Preparations began months in advance. Temple officials would often add large quantities of psychoactive substances derived from lotus flowers and other plants. The resulting concoction wasn't just intoxicating, it also produced hallucinations and dramatically lowered inhibitions. Participants reported seeing visions, hearing divine voices, and feeling possessed by supernatural forces. When the festival began, normal social norms completely disappeared. Masters engaged in sexual intercourse with slaves in public squares. Married women left their families to join traveling groups of revelers. Children were subjected to open acts of intimacy and often became participants themselves. The entire civilization was plunged into chaos that lasted for 7 days and 7 nights. Ancient texts describe scenes that shock even modern readers. Groups of drunken Egyptians roamed the cities, breaking into homes and forcing residents to join their celebrations. Women were subjected to group abuse, considered religious communes. Men, completely intoxicated, would compete to see who could maintain sexual arousal for the longest period of time. The violence was as extreme as the sexuality itself. Participants would attack each other in a sexual frenzy, biting, scratching, and inflicting wounds that were considered signs of divine favor. Some revelers died from internal injuries resulting from the violent sexual acts. Others were crushed to death by crowds of drunken celebrants moving through the narrow streets. The religious justification made everything even more disturbing. Priests taught that every act performed during the festival was, by definition, sacred because participants were possessed by divine spirits. Abuse became a religious commune. Violence became a sacred offering. Child abuse became a divine blessing. Foreign visitors left accounts of these celebrations that revealed international horror. Mesopotamian diplomats described the festival as proof that the Egyptians were barbarians, disguised as a sophisticated civilization. Some kingdoms refused to send ambassadors to Egypt during the festival period, fearing for their safety and moral contamination. The aftermath of the festival was as traumatic as the event itself. Participants often had no memory of what they had done while intoxicated, leading to psychological trauma when they discovered evidence of their actions. Families were destroyed when members learned what their relatives had done during the celebration. Children born 9 months after the festival were branded as the offspring of divine ecstasy rather than a normal pregnancy. The economic impact was staggering.
Entire cities shut down for a week as the population participated in a drunken revelry. Agricultural work ground to a halt, commerce ground to a halt, and government functions ground to a halt. The cost of lost productivity was immense. However, the pharaohs viewed it as a necessary expense to maintain cosmic balance. The festival also served political purposes. It provided a safety valve for social tensions, allowing the Egyptian system to maintain a rigid hierarchy for most of the year. Citizens could rebel against authority, masters could be humiliated by slaves, and social norms could be violated. However, only during this period of carefully controlled chaos does archaeological evidence confirm the extreme nature of these festivals.
Excavations of temple sites reveal special chambers with features suggesting they were used for violent and humiliating acts designed for group sexual activity. The physical evidence matches the disturbing accounts left by ancient writers. The systematic decline of Egyptian sexual culture began during the Ptolemy period, when Greek rulers attempted to impose Mediterranean values on Egyptian religious practices. The clash between Greek rationalism and Egyptian sexual mysticism created a crisis that ultimately destroyed both systems. Despite being foreign rulers, the Ptolemies were forced to participate in Egyptian religious festivals to maintain legitimacy with their subjects. However, Greek sensitivities were appalled by the excessive sexual practices they encountered. Cleopatra attempted to modify the drunken feast, shortening its duration and imposing limits on violence and public sexuality. These reforms triggered a religious crisis. Egyptian priests argued that changing the festival would anger the gods and bring about cosmic disaster. They pointed to natural disasters, military defeats, and economic problems as evidence that the gods were already displeased with foreign interference in sacred traditions. The crisis reached its peak during Cleopatra's reign, when Shaku faced the impossible task of meeting both Egyptian religious expectations and Roman political demands. Roman observers were scandalized by Egyptian sexual practices, viewing them as evidence of barbarism and moral decay. However, Egyptian priests threatened rebellion if traditional festivals were abandoned entirely. Cleopatra's solution was to create special versions of the festivals for Egyptian religious leaders while presenting a more modest public face to Roman audiences. This compromise satisfied no one and created a culture of hypocrisy that undermined both Egyptian religious authority and Roman political control. Child abuse became even more systematic during this period, as desperate rulers tried to prove their devotion to Egyptian traditions while concealing the evidence from the Romans. Child slaves were bought and sold in greater numbers. The abuses took place in secret rooms that Roman officials were forbidden from entering. The psychological burden on Egyptian society was immense. Generations of children had been raised in a system that normalized sexual violence and religious extremism. When external pressure led to changes in these practices, many Egyptians experienced a form of cultural trauma. They lost not only their religious traditions, but also their entire framework for understanding sexuality and the divine relationship. The final collapse came with the Roman conquest in 30 BC. Augustus Caesar was horrified by what his forces discovered in Egyptian temples and ordered the immediate suppression of sexual religious practices. Roman soldiers destroyed explicit artwork, burned religious texts, and executed priests who refused to abandon traditional ceremonies. But the Romans didn't just suppress Egyptian sexual practices, they systematically erased any evidence of their existence. Temples were stripped of their explicit ornamentation, papyruses describing sexual rituals were burned, and even architectural features designed for religious sexuality were destroyed or hidden. Children trapped in this system faced a particularly tragic fate. Many were so thoroughly conditioned for sexual servitude that they were unable to adapt to normal life. Roman records describe ancient temple children who committed suicide rather than face a world where their only perceived value had been eliminated. The survivors carried the trauma that affected Egyptian society for generations. Systematic sexual abuse created patterns of behavior and belief that could not easily be erased by political conquest. Roman governors reported ongoing problems with underground sexual cultures, child trafficking networks, and religious movements attempting to covertly restore traditional practices. But even the Romans couldn't erase all the evidence. What they left behind would shock Victorian archaeologists into creating the largest cover-up in archaeological history. The systematic concealment of Egyptian sexual practices began not with ancient conspiracies, but with Victorian moral sensibilities unable to cope with archaeological truth. When 19th-century explorers first encountered explicit sexual imagery in Egyptian tombs and temples, they faced a cultural crisis that shaped Egyptology for 15 centuries. The pattern was established early. When Giovanni Belzoni discovered explicitly sexual murals in the Tomb of Sin in 1817, he ordered them immediately covered with plaster rather than document them. His published account described the tomb as containing beautiful religious scenes, completely omitting the graphic sexual content that filled several rooms. This became standard practice throughout the Victorian era. Auguste Mariette, founder of the Egyptian Antiquities Service, maintained private collections of explicit artifacts that were never publicly displayed. When the Egyptian Museum in Cairo was established, all categories of artifacts were assigned to restricted storage areas accessible only to male scholars. The censorship was not limited to images. Victorian translators routinely edited sexual content from ancient texts, replacing explicit descriptions with euphemistic phrases, or simply omitting entire passages.
The famous Ebers Papyrus, one of ancient Egypt's most important medical texts, contained more than 40 sections on sexual practices that remained untranslated until the 1970s. Perhaps most striking was the systematic destruction of evidence. British archaeologist Flinders Petrie openly admitted to destroying artifacts he deemed too obscene for public consumption. He described burning chronicles and papyruses, dismembering statues, and dismantling artifacts depicting sexual acts he dared not document. Earthbros extended to academic institutions. Universities refused to fund research on Egyptian sexuality, deeming it unsuitable for scientific study. Students interested in these topics were discouraged or expelled. Academic journals rejected articles discussing sexual practices even when based on solid archaeological evidence. Museums developed complex systems to conceal sexual artifacts. The British Museum alone houses over 2,800 suppressed Egyptian artifacts, stored in restricted areas labeled as various pottery or decorative objects. More recently, in 2019, the Louvre was caught hiding newly discovered papyruses from the public. Even Wikipedia articles on these topics are mysteriously locked in editing. Visitors seeking to view these items face bureaucratic hurdles designed to stifle casual curiosity. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York maintains similar restrictions. Its Egyptian galleries display sanitized versions of sexually explicit tomb paintings, either covered up or digitally removed. The original artwork remains in storage. It is accessible only to researchers who demonstrate a legitimate academic need and agree to strict confidentiality requirements. Even today, this Victorian legacy continues to shape public understanding of ancient Egypt. Popular documentaries and museum exhibitions focus entirely on political history, religious beliefs, and artistic achievements, completely ignoring the sexual practices central to Egyptian culture. The result is a sanitized version of history that bears little resemblance to the complex and often disturbing reality of ancient Egyptian life. This continued concealment has created vast gaps in public knowledge about human sexuality, religious practices, and social organization in one of history's most influential civilizations. The horrors hidden in Egyptian tombs and texts reveal how easily religious devotion can devolve into systematic abuse when human sexuality becomes a tool of cosmic control. For 3,000 years, Egyptian civilization created and perpetuated practices that treated children as sexual property, normalized violence as religious practice, and used intimacy as a weapon of political domination.